have time for questions. And Professor Landis, if you might address three aspects of the Syrian situation. One, an overview of what the situation is today in Syria, including the crisis that's brought on by U.S. sanctions. Two, what has been the U.S. role in Syria and its aims over the years? And three, why is it that we get such one-sided and distorted coverage, in our view, about the situation in Syria? And then hopefully we'll have some discussion and some questions. So with that said, could you take it away, Professor Landis?
I can, and thank you so much for the kind introduction, Jeff Klein, and for inviting me here. I'd like to thank Sheila Foreman, who sought me out, and I saw that Medea Benjamin is in your crowd too, and I've been in a number of conferences with her and admire her work immensely. And as I can see, there are many interesting people here on this panel, so it's a pleasure to be able to join you, and I thank the Mass Peace Action for inviting me here today. Let me just jump in with what's going on today and do a sort of scene setter. And I want to start.
Could we see Landis, please? We're looking at Jeff Klein. I'd like to see Landis, please.
You can change your window to see both of them.
You go to your upper right-hand corner and it says view. There's a little box that says view, and you can put it on speaker view or gallery. If you put it on speaker view, it'll work. At any rate, let me jump in with what's going on today in Syria and begin with the words of the special envoy to Syria under President Trump, Ambassador James Jeffrey, who stepped down just as Trump was stepping down. And he's now at the Woodrow Wilson Institute in Washington, D.C., and he's been doing a number of interviews after stepping down, which I think have been very revealing. And he's really laid out a picture of what his policy was and what I think the ongoing Biden policy is. And that is to turn Syria into a quagmire in order for Russia and Iran. And this is really about our maximum pressure campaign on Iran and also our continuing competition with Russia. And the way that that pressure is being applied is in a number of ways. He's got a number of instruments that America can apply. And I'm going to switch you over to look at a map of Syria, if I may. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope you can see this map of Syria on there. And the most important way that America can pressure Assad and turn Syria into a quagmire is by taking land away from Assad, denying Assad valuable territory. And you'll see in the north of Syria here, about 35% of Syrian territory is under foreign occupation. The yellow part in the northeast, which is predominantly Kurdish, well, there's a large Kurdish population, but there's also a very big Arab tribal population there as well. That area is dominated by America. There are little splots near Qamishli where the Assad government still has some troops, and the Russians are in certain little areas. There's a big green between Ras Al Ain and Tel Abyad. There's a big green splotch which is dominated by Turkey with Arab militias that were part of the Free Syrian Army. And then in the left, over on the western side of Syria, is Turkish-dominated region. And by denying this area to Assad, the United States is also denying Assad the majority of Syria's oil, the vast majority of Syria's oil, which is not tons. Before the war, Syria was producing about 300,000 barrels a day, but that was supplying the government with about 40% of the government income. That's gone today. And so is the Northeast is largely the wheat growing area because there's a mountain range that runs along the border with Turkey, and water falls on it and comes down that area. You also see that the Euphrates River goes through there, and that's the dam is controlled by the United States, the Assad Dam. And so this is an extraordinarily important area for Syria, both for providing food, a big cotton crop, and oil, most importantly. So Damascus is very much diminished. Their income is diminished. Turkey, of course, is holding other areas. There's a big green splotch down in the southern area, and that is owned by the United States. That is near El Tunf, is a small town. What you don't see on here is that the major highway that links Damascus to Baghdad runs through El Tunf. And America has holding that so that no trade can go on between Iraq, Iran, and Syria. So this has allowed the United States really to cut Syria off from its neighbors. Turkey doesn't trade. Iraq can't really trade. Lebanon's in a financial crisis today with the collapse of its currency, which has been devastating for Syria because most of Syria's banking is done through Lebanon. And so Syria has really been brought to its knees economically by this blockade. There's also sanctions, which are very stringent on Syria. And they're designed, the most recent Caesar sanctions, target reconstruction, and particularly gas and oil, to deny Syria the import of any oil. So the U.S. is denying Syria oil that it produces itself, Syria does, as well as imports of oil. Israel has been, with the encouragement of the United States, attacking military emplacements where the Iranians or Hezbollah have set up shop. They have bombed close, many hundreds of times in the last few years. But the Wall Street Journal carried an article just the other day describing that Israel had sabotaged over 12 oil tankers coming from Iran that were attempting to bring oil into Syria. And these have been mined and then blown big holes into and have been scuttled. There are 4 Iranian tankers that were caught in Suez Canal when this ship was stuck there. They are now just coming out of the canal, and they're hovering in the Mediterranean outside of the canal. I think they're waiting for a Russian military convoy so that they won't be attacked and can get to Syria. This is important, obviously, for the Syrians because they're getting no electricity. They don't have cooking fuel. The situation is pretty grim, and especially in the mountain areas where it's very cold, or out in the desert where it gets very cold in the evenings, there is no light and there's no heat. So people, my in-laws in Syria who live on the coast are fairly safe, but they go to bed at 8 in the evening because it's warm, and they can't get fuel. My brother-in-law, who runs a little factory, he's set up 3 different businesses since the war started. He's lost 3 businesses. His most recent is to make little plastic bags and other things, and he had to shut down because there was no electricity, only about an hour a day, and there's no fuel to run generators. So it had become way too expensive. So he had to, this is the problem of Syria today, is there's not enough fuel. The prices have gone through the roof, and there's a lot of pressure that has come on Syria, and so the World Health Organization is screaming bloody murder. The UN Special Council on Sanctions, there's a woman who's professor who oversees sanctions, and she says the sanctions are terrible. They're hurting people, and she said that they need to be lifted. So the economic situation is grim. The World Food Program says that about 60% of Syrians don't have enough to eat, and about 80% of Syrians live under the poverty line today. And now, a large measure of that, of course, is due to the civil war and the tremendous destruction during this war. Syria has really been devastated, as you know, with tons of internally displaced. 6 million people have fled the country. And that means, more than half of Syrians have been displaced for some time during this war. Many have lost their homes. 40% of the schools have been destroyed. But most devastating recently has been the collapse of the Lebanese pound. And that has been particularly devastating because almost all Syrians did their banking in Lebanon. And they kept their money in dollar accounts in Lebanon, thinking that those would be safe. But it turns out that Lebanon was running more or less of a Ponzi scheme by trying to keep the Lebanese pound at a fixed rate, and it has gone bankrupt. And everybody who had an account there has lost their money. My family, about 4 members of my wife's family had their life savings in Lebanon, which just went up in smoke. And this has caused the Syrian pound to take a nosedive. Right in tandem, if you look at the graph of the Lebanese pound and the Syrian pound, they have swooned almost identical amounts. The graphs are identical. So it really shows you how linked to Lebanon. That's an event that really is quite independent of the Syrian civil war. Of course, the Syrian civil war had a very bad effect on the Lebanese economy, undermined the pound and so forth, because trade with Syria, which is Lebanon's only neighboring trading partner, was cut off. And American sanctions, which put secondary sanctions on anybody doing business in Syria, anybody helping to build, reconstruct electric plants with gas and oil, helping the government in any way through reconstruction can be sanctioned by the Treasury Department. So that means the Lebanese businessmen, which were very important in Syria, can't do business there. And neither can Turkish or Jordanian or Iraqi businessmen. So it's really frozen. Now, I don't want to blame America for all of Syria's, it's unfair to do that. The Assad regime, as Jeff Klein said, has been brutally hanging on to power. And the opposition has not been unified, and it has been very chaotic and fighting each other, but have also not been exemplary. And in fact, they spooked America so much that America abandoned them in 2015 and turned towards the Kurds, who are America's close allies in Syria today. But let me just finish that question about what's going on in Syria today by underlining this really miserable economic situation. And I will cap that off with a little statement of my wife, who is Syrian and her family lives in Latakia on the coast, Mediterranean coast. She wanted to go visit in April. She wanted to go visit her parents, who are in their 80s. Her father's in his 80s. And she'd gone 2 years ago and had a good time taking our children and so forth. And this time her father said, "Don't come. It's just too grim. Nobody's going out to restaurants. There's no electricity. We sit in the dark in the evening times. You can't charge your phone. Everybody runs the wall when the electricity comes on for about an hour and charges their phone and anything else." So he said it will be no fun, and you won't, you shouldn't come now. So she's not going, which sort of broke her heart, but it's really bad. My parents, who have retirement, my mother-in-law was a teacher for almost 30 years. My father-in-law was in the Syrian military and was the headmaster of the Naval Academy. He was in the Navy. He was the headmaster of the Naval Academy for 10 years. And so between them, they had pensions that added up to almost $500 a month. We did the math recently. Because of inflation, the collapse of the pound, they can now buy, they estimated, 8 roasted chickens at the local chicken shop for their monthly, for the equivalent of their monthly income. And they were well off, upper middle class Syrians. But most Syrians don't have that, don't have family abroad who can send them money, and are in no way protected from this collapse in the currency. So there's long lines. The government provides the bread. It used to be that most people would go to private bread shops and buy their bread from a bakery. But today, the private bakeries charge too much money for bread, that everybody has to go to these government-supported bakeries where you can buy a not very good quality bread for very little money that's very subsidized. And there's tremendously long lines. It's, you wait hours. And that's partly because Syria's not getting enough wheat. And fuel has gone through the roof, you name it. So those are the humiliations that people are living with, is long lines to get everything. They can't afford to do much. And life is in a terrible situation. Now, so that's what's going on. Let me go with your second question, was what is the U.S. role? I've sort of drawn out the role. But what I'd like to stress here is that the U.S., what is the U.S. trying to do in Iraq, other than just turn it into a quagmire to punish its enemies, Iran, Russia, and Assad? In theory, Ambassador James Jeffrey said, and now Blinken says, what we are doing is we are pressuring Assad to accept UN Resolution 2254, which was issued in 2015. And the UN resolution calls for free and fair elections in Syria and the participation of the opposition in any new government, and a non-sectarian government. All things which mean that Assad could not rule. It's basically tantamount to regime change. Now, what's the likelihood of Assad stepping down or allowing UN representatives in to oversee and run fair elections? I think it's zero. The UN is not going to, the US is not going to achieve its stated goal, which is to turn Syria into a fair country with power sharing and federalism and a bunch of other nostrums that various officials have used. They're not going to bring justice to Syrians through the sanctions. And they don't have the tools to achieve these ends. And that's really what it comes down to. Can they possibly achieve their political goals, or stated political goals, with the tools they have at hand, which is isolating Syria, keeping 35% of the territory under their control, sanctions, so forth, scuttling oil shipments to Syria, and stopping trade? They can't. Assad will hang on. And essentially, the United States finds itself in a game of chicken, where he is punishing the Syrian people by staying in power, if you will, and America's punishing the Syrian people because he's staying in power. And it's a game of chicken of who's going to blink first. And unfortunately, it's the poorest and most vulnerable Syrians who are going to suffer. Economic sanctions rarely work. There are a few successful examples, but there are myriads of unsuccessful. The academic literature indicates that they're rarely successful, especially in tough dictatorships like Assad's. This was the story with Iraq in the 1990s when we put sanctions on Saddam Hussein, And the UN estimated that almost 500,000 Iraqis died as a result of those sanctions. And something similar is likely to happen in Syria. And I think we should expect that the humanitarian situation is going to go from very bad to worse with time as this deprivation continues and will likely get worse. And that's my answer to number 2, what is America doing? And let me stop, I'm going to get to the mainstream media, but let me stop here for a second and get a discussion going for a bit. And I think the other question will answer itself as we move on.